Welcome to the Unity Guides Expert Interviews series. My name is Clayton Stenson. I'll be your host today. This series is brought to you by the Unity Guide, where we help develop Unity within companies running on the entrepreneurial operating system. We do this through fractional integrator services and coaching for the visionary and integrator, as well as their leadership teams. Recently, I've been meeting so many amazing people, and I thought there has to be a way I can take a piece of the conversations I have week in and week out and share them with the business community to add value. And one of those amazing people that I know is Chris McPhee. Chris is an EOS implementer in the Calgary market. And the topic we're going to discuss today is process. So welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So before we get into the interview, I just have a couple questions for you. Firstly, Chris, what is EOS in your own words, or entrepreneurial operating system?
Sure. So just a really high-level summary, EOS is really a complete and proven system with simple and practical tools that's really focused on helping entrepreneurs, owners, business leaders get what they want from their business. It's focused on three main things. We help our clients get better at vision. So from the standpoint of getting the leadership team 100% on the same page as far as where the company is going, how it's going to get there. And then, of course, how it's going to get there is about traction, instilling the accountability and discipline, making sure that leadership team have the tools and accountability, discipline to get that vision that they've basically set for themselves. And then the third part is healthy. That's about creating a healthy, functional, really well-oiled leadership team, because a lot of times what we find is leadership members, they just don't do their best work in that team environment. They're not used to really focusing on their leadership team as being their number one team. So it's really that combination, helping companies typically between 10 and 250 people in size. Can work for smaller, can work for larger, but the sweet spot is that size of company that's got growth aspirations and really needs just enough tools and discipline to be able to match that with their entrepreneurial spirit.
And then how did you discover EOS and become an implementer?
Sure. Well, I had some of the, typical frustrations that entrepreneurs have during, their growth stage of their company. And I'd worked with really large companies prior to my kind of entrepreneurial journey, and bringing in some of those systems and processes was just overwhelming. It was too burdensome for a growth-oriented company, about 15 to 20 people at the time that I discovered EOS. And I came across the book Traction. It was recommended to me by a friend. And I thought, oh, this is nothing new, but it's just the basics. It's the simple stuff that I think is going to work for us in our company without too much overhead and bureaucracy. And so I put that system in place. I self-implemented. EOS is what we call it when we kind of do it ourselves, and made a lot of mistakes, but really was able to see the value of that system. Really got the company to the next level. It got us to a level where a really attractive company for a strategic buyer, and so sold the company. And when I thought about what was next, a lot of people who've sub businesses are then looking, well, what's the next stage? And I really felt like, I'm sure there's a lot of companies that felt the same kind of challenges that I did, and I really liked what EOS did for me. And so then I went through the certification process to become an implementer myself, and now I help other entrepreneurial leadership teams, alleviate the frustrations they've got so that they can get what they want from their business through set of simple tools and disciplines that we collectively call the entrepreneurial operating system.
That's awesome. That's great. Love it. All right. Well, let's shift gears and get into the interview. So when I asked you to do this interview, you said you wanted to discuss process. So tell me why you chose that.
Sure. I think I've always been drawn to organization. I guess my personality is very much like organization, systems, always looking at ways that things could be more efficient. Like I even think of when I was a kid and standing in line to get my picture taken with Santa and looking at it, I think this is such an inefficient system they've got set up here. Everybody's in one line. Like, I think I could do this and this and just get this more organized. And like, oh, I think I'm set up for a life of something that's relating to process. But the reason that I chose process for this is that what I found was, depending on the kind of organization you're in, you can actually overdo process. And I've been very much complicit in that as well. Like just seeing that, well, more process has got to be better, more structure has got to be better, and you need some structure, and certainly a lot of companies I work with now, they need some structure and discipline because the company was often built based on the energy of that founding entrepreneur and just sheer force of will to get stuff going and just do what the customer wants and get it working. And that's great. It gets you to a certain level, but then it's hard then for that entrepreneur to really grow and scale the business because it's so reliant on them and their knowledge, and they get frustrated when people don't do the things the same way that they might do them, and yet they don't know how to structure it, or they get frustrated with people maybe taking liberties where they wouldn't, or not taking liberties where they would. And so
Right.
the reason that, I guess, to sum that up, where I find is that if you can get that sweet spot of the just enough process, you get the consistent results, then you really free up so many resources. You can provide that creativity, but you also want to avoid going too deep, really creating these massive process documents because nobody looks at them, they don't follow them, and then you actually are almost as worse off because now you've got process that nobody follows, and
Yeah, you've got a really a good paperweight that's taken a lot of time to make.
Exactly. And the thing people forget sometimes is that processes change, right? Your business changes, involves, market changes, involves. And the more effort you put into that first version of the process manual document, the less likely you are to actually make any changes to it in the future. And so there's a whole bunch of, I guess, maybe non-intuitive reasons why that sweet spot of the process is so critical, because if you get that right fit, it's easier to train, it's easier to manage, it's easier for people to understand what you need to do, and it's easier for them to understand where they can take liberties with the process as well. My very first job in a corporate world was basically an IT, information technology manual, and my job was kind of to teach and then audit that process. And it's like, I don't know, nothing against dentists, but not a lot of us love going to get your dental work, and I was kind of like, worse than the dentist. It's like, are you following your IT processes and procedures? It's like, oh my goodness, I've got better things to do than talk to this guy.
That's interesting. That's you, who is somebody who is interested in process, was still bothered by that. So that says something. One thing that I just want to mention is I have someone that I know and through networking and stuff that he calls it subverbal intellectual property. It's like the stuff that's in the visionary's head that no one else knows. And like you explained, they're frustrated because other people aren't doing it the right way with the way that they would do it. But it's never been verbalized. It's never been written down, and it's impossible for people to think the way that you think if you haven't, done some kind of way of writing it down and communicating to your people. Is that kind of sum it up to similar to what you were meaning?
Yeah. And I think there's also an interesting challenge that visionary has, which is they kind of just figured it out. Right? They're often really intuitive. They're often very, often, not always, but often very, very good with people, at least being able to understand what those needs are. And they're entrepreneurs. They figured out a niche in the market, and they've started to address that. And so sometimes they can be frustrated, on two ends. So one, frustrated that people aren't doing it right, but the other is frustrated that they're not doing it the way they would. And so that's sometimes a challenge is looking at that minimal process to say, well, you hired this person not to be a robot, but actually to provide value to your company. And with an entrepreneurial company, things are changing and shifting. And so if you get them to do exactly what you did you always do it that way, or did you kind of learn and evolve that over time?
Yeah.
So if you just kind of take the minimal set of steps that need to be performed to get the consistent results, but give that flexibility to provide a little bit of creativity. I know that was for me as a manager, the first big aha is looking at somebody following a minimal process and getting the results that they desired, and then me thinking, oh, that's not the way I would have done it, Like it was still follow the process. It was just, took a little, liberties where the process wasn't as specific. But it's great. They got the results they needed. It was more comfortable for them because that was fitting to their particular way of doing. And in a lot of cases, they're creative people as well. They found ways to maybe optimize or make the process better. Mm-hmm. And so it was really kind of liberating concept to think, well, they think differently than me, and they got the results that I want, mm-hmm. and they followed the basics of the process. So win-win, right? Yeah. Like when you think about what people often complain about with their jobs, like number 2 or 3, if not number 1, is always, I feel like I'm micromanaged, right? And you think that, well, what are the symptoms that led to the micromanagement? More times than not, it's whether it's verbal or it's written down, the process is just detailed out in such a degree that the individual doesn't feel like they had any autonomy in that. Maybe they can clearly see where the process is burdensome or not value added, and yet feel like they can't step outside of that bounds at all because somebody will come down on them. So that whole concept of micromanaging, I think we think about micromanaging as a person telling you specifically what to do, but process can do that same thing, and it still feels like you're being micromanaged.
Yeah. That's good. It's good. Interesting. Listen to this morning. I was listening to Radical Candor. Have you read that book?
Yes.
I was listening to it on the way back from the gym this morning, and there was an interesting section in there. It said it was a story about Steve Jobs, and someone was talking about Steve Jobs and said that Steve always gets it right. And I, at first I was like, what does that mean? But that he continued and he explained that Steve always gets it right because he asks his teams to challenge him when he's wrong. And therefore, and he listens to them, and therefore he always gets it right. Right. Like doesn't mean he's right all the time. It means that he is open to other people's feedback. And I'm just thinking about in the area of process, as speaking to the visionary right now, like if you don't open up your process the way you would do it to feedback, and if maybe it's not the best way, and so there might be someone in your organization that has a better idea than you, right? And that's part of the problem too, right? I think if you do the top down, this is how we do it, and don't open it up for any discussion, then you feel micromanaged. You feel like you have no autonomy because you don't. Mm-hmm. Right. And people want to be involved. Right. And when you allow people to help you build your process or be creative with the process, then it's theirs. Right. It's not yours. It's not the company's. It's ours that we work together on. So
that's right. Yeah. With the only caveat being, and I can absolutely kind of picture the kind of scenario, and I've seen this a lot before as well, is that you want to have people have some faith in the process. You've written it out and followed it.
Yeah.
I have seen situations where, without even going through the process, you have people, well, why do we do this? And we shouldn't have to do this. And I think there's that fine balance of, and I guess the end of that story is, I think that's where sometimes the visionaries get frustrated, is that there's like, this works, just do it. Right. And somebody coming in may see some challenges with that, but also might not see the benefit of following it. And the flip side of that is an organization that I worked with. He said, we can clearly see 90% of the times when we had, an issue with quality, it's because somebody skipped a step in the process. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The process seemed overburdensome in terms of what it was. And so there is that balance of understanding the why behind the process, and then the what you're expecting. And so the only thing I would caveat in terms of the kind of being part of developing the process is the steps aren't actually often as important as understanding what's driving those particular steps. Right. And one example that I don't know if you've heard of, you might have, because it's relatively common, but it's this story around this young woman who's cooking a turkey for Thanksgiving dinner, and she gets her mother to help her with it, because the mother has kind of passed this down through generations, and she cuts the ends off the turkey for whatever reason.
Oh yeah.
And so she says, well, why did you do that? And she said, I don't know. My grandma or my mother, your grandma, always taught me to do that. And so well, let's ask grandma. And so grandma said, I'm not sure. My mother just always did that. And so their grandma was in the nursing home and called her up, and she said, just trying to understand, like, why did we do this? And she said, oh, we had a small roasting pan, so the turkeys never fit in it, and so we always had to cut out the ends to put it in. It's like, oh, okay. So it's one of those things too. When we're looking at process, it's often the case of,
Yeah.
if something doesn't make sense, certainly question it, but also to understand, there probably was some rationale at some point for for this, and the question becomes, is that rationale still valid? And if it is, then follow the process because it works. If it isn't, then there's some opportunities for that. But I can appreciate where sometimes those visionaries are like, stop asking questions, just do it, versus but there's a better way, right? And how do you balance that? And so that's part of as well, where you can't keep the process static, but you can't also be changing it all the time, where it's not really a process. It's just you're changing.
Yeah. And I think, like, just thinking about what you just said, the visionary probably shouldn't, like integrators are more designed, right, for creating processes, and visionaries will get bored, right, by that quite often, right? So the right people should be in the room. Yeah, the visionaries, if it's the first time you've ever developed process, they've got to be involved at some level, but may be better if they're not as involved with the minutia of it, right? Would you agree?
I think quite often, what I've found, and it's not across the board, but it seems more common than not, is the visionaries are not a lot of attention for the fine detail. Certainly know what they want as the end result, and have been very intuitive, got a good sense for the business, the product, the opportunity, whatever that is. And they've made their way through it, and they know where they can tweak and change it. And so, and then the flip side, the integrator typically is, very process oriented, systems oriented, maybe not quite as creative, not necessarily not creative, but maybe not quite as intuitively creative in that particular part of the business. And so a great way to, I find, initially start is not try to overcomplicate it. Just have that integrator talk to the visionary and say, okay, how'd you do this? Just tell me the story of how you made the sale, or how you came up with this product idea, or how you've incorporated some of the customer feedback over time in terms of this. And the visionaries are often great storytellers, right? That's often what they've done well. And my real aha for this was when I was working with my visionary partner. I was very much that integrator mindset, and he was great at kind of painting the picture of where he saw the vision to be. And I remember called him into the boardroom and said, okay, I put together a plan. This isn't around the process side of things, but it kind of adjacent. And he said, oh, that's where I knew that, we were right. is that I could so clearly see the vision, but I didn't really clearly see the steps to get there. And I couldn't necessarily see the vision like he could until he, explained it, and we walked through it a little bit. But then it was clear, we'll do A, B, C, and D, and that's how it'll work. And I think the process is, kind of similar to that as well, right? It's even that case where the visionary can just intuitively figure their way through that customer call. But if you can listen to them for a few different calls, and it's like, okay, you definitely got a process. It's just
draw it out.
It's maybe not something that it's easy for you to say because you don't think in that sort of a linear process mindset. But by watching and observing you've got a process. And if we can kind of pull that out and take the nuggets of what we need consistently done by someone else, but then also appreciate that when you would say, well, I don't always do this because, this situation or that situation, it's like, okay, that's maybe where we leave it a little bit open to some flexibility in this process. And we'll optimize and simplify it over time. But that way you're not trying to boil the ocean with every little process detail, which can be overwhelming and certainly not something that a visionary has the focused energy to go through.
Yeah, that's really good. The integrator mind has that ability to see patterns and to draw out that kind of stuff. Like you said, you're in line with Santa, and, like you just you just see it. Like that's my whole life. That's how I've been too. It's like, it's every situation I come into. It's like, how can I do this most efficiently? And I've always done well, and in roles because of that, because my brain works that way.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, you're right. That's really good. Um, so what other advice do you have for someone who maybe has never documented their processes? Where do you start? Like,
Yeah.
it can feel overwhelming if there's maybe 50 processes you have to do.
Yeah. It's a great question because I think you hit the nail on the head, overwhelming, right? Like it just feels like, well, I know what ISO is, or, I know when people say process, it means this big manual that, we get audited on. And so that's what it feels like process
Yeah.
is. And so what I teach and what EOS implementers teach is really just a set of core business processes, just the handful of processes that'll get you the consistent results that you need. And so things like an HR process, how you recruit and manage people, a marketing process, how you create demand for your product or service, a sales process, how you turn those, those leads into sales orders. Typically a handful of operations processes, but not a ton, just, the key ways that you design, you develop, you deliver your product or service, an accounting process, how you manage your assets, your cash, maybe a customer service or retention process. So that's what we're talking about, just the core set of processes. Don't overcomplicate it. There's those handful of processes. And then the big aha that I had is a lot of times the reason that process document becomes overwhelming is because we had a person who wasn't the right person in the right seat, and they kept screwing up in that particular role. And so we say, okay, they screwed up in this, we add this step, we screwed up in this, we add this step. And pretty soon you got this massive process document because you didn't deal with that person.
Right.
And that's really common. So it's not like if you've ever had that, I know I've had that before. As person, I like the person, they just keeps messing up. So we need to add more and more process steps. Mm-hmm. So the big mindset shift I find is, well, who does this really well in your organization? Who's your best salesperson? Who's your best software developer? Who's your best accounting support person? Whatever that looks like, and just talk to them. Same way as you would with the visionary. It's like, well, just tell me, walk me through this, system installation, and document the high points with that. And what we find then is what you're doing is you're saying, okay, they're our best people, probably because they do our best work in some way, shape, or form. And so rather than going to the person who barely gets by and has to have all this detail, go to the person who just does it really well, get it what's out of their head, and don't overthink it, right? When I go to hire somebody, what do you do? Well, I do this, I do this, I do this. How do you manage your team? Well, I have a weekly level 10, and then we have one-to-ones once a quarter, and you're just capturing those high points, right? And then that way, what you've done is you've simplified your processes, but you've also kept the nuggets of what's really critical in that particular process. And then, of course, you had your best people be part of it. So that's something that you want to, maintain and have be the basis for your process documentation going forward. And I had a question. Actually, I did a workshop recently, and somebody said, "Well, we're in the wearable health tech industry, and there's a huge number of regulations around this. And so how do I manage that?" And so we just talked about it a little through in terms of how we could do it. And thought, well, what about if you had a quality control business process, and one of those quality control checks was confirm that the regulations for this product have been followed. And so it's like, oh, well, that makes sense, right? Because what I was trying to figure out was, how do you balance all that level of details required for this specific part of what we do, but really balance that with the business side of things. And the danger is thinking, well, if we follow that level of rigor for this specific regulatory aspect, then we need that same sort of rigor for all of our process documentation. And so that's where I try to divide a bit of that line between, these are high level business processes. You're going to have detailed rules, procedures for certain aspects of the business. You'll probably have an HR policies and procedures manual, and that'll have all the depth of the legality in terms of to follow. But that's separate from your best practices as a HR business process. And so once you kind of separate mentally that aspect of it, then all of a sudden I found, and even in that conversation, it's like, oh, okay, well, yeah, we could have a quality control process that has a handful of steps. One of those steps, if this particular device, requires that kind of regulatory approval, then we spin into the detailed government-based regulations. But that's not our business process. That's
No.
specific quality control around that. So
Yeah, that's good.
that's where we really start, is just really simple handful of checklists, just the basics to get there. Another analogy, not sure if this hits or not, but sometimes it helps, is sometimes people think about, okay, I'm creating a recipe for baking chocolate chip cookies. And so what they feel like is they need to create a cookbook that has like all of the level of details, like first go to the oven, set it to 425, wait 10
Right.
minutes, then, blah, 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 blah. And what we're saying is we're not teaching somebody to cook. This is like your grandma's recipe that basically is, take these ingredients, pinch of salt, mix and bake, right? And so like that doesn't teach you to cook, but it gives you
Right.
the consistent set of instructions for somebody who already knows how to cook
Right.
to be able to get the results that we want.
Yeah.
And then that way, you've gotten that bit of a balance. It doesn't stand by itself. You can't then probably hand this to an employee and say, just do it. They still need to be trained. You still need to make sure you're measuring, things like basic compliance, the results, the frequency, those kind of things. But it then, gives you that just enough. And that's where we get into the US side of the just enough structure and discipline without creating that corporate bureaucracy, overhead, which is required once you often get to a certain size of company.
Yeah.
But for an entrepreneurial company, it's just too burdensome, and people won't do it, and then it's a lost cause.
Yeah, I think about like a company like McDonald's, right? Like there is a very defined way that you do everything. There's Hamburger University, but they have, I don't know, tens and tens of thousands of locations, and the fries are exactly the same no matter where you go.
Right, exactly.
And I've been to probably 7 or 8 different countries and had their fries, and they're exactly the same. But yeah, in a smaller company, you can't do that. And another thing that just came to mind when you were talking about that last point was sales, right? Like you can have a sales process and steps. And I've done sale. I used to sell Cutco cutlery when I was in university, and there was a system, and they actually even gave you a script. But if you just followed that rotely, it's like, if I was at your house, it's like, hello, Christopher McPhee, how are you? Like it's like, you know what I mean? Like you can't, you have to make it your own, right? Like you have to, there's key things that you want to make sure that you do. Like for Cutco, it was you cut a rope with their knife, and then you cut a rope with the Cutco. You cut leather. Like there was just certain things that you wanted to make sure that you did and you didn't miss. But you also have to make it your own and relaxed, within that structure, right? So I think that's a challenge sometimes. If it's too detailed, then it just feels constraining and uncomfortable.
Right.
That's good.
Yeah, and I think people naturally will evolve over time as well, right? So that's part of the idea of the sweet spot of the process. I think that the challenge is we're tempted to have it be all detailed to the nth degree, and then we get partway through the push process and give up because it's just way too much effort. And so the flip side is, and we don't have any process at all. And so to your point on that, you probably had, when you were training or however that looked, or there was a job shadow or something like that, really in-depth script and all the details, all that kind of thing. Yeah. But when you're actually have developed some level of competence, then you probably just need that checklist just to make sure you cut the rope with their knife and with your knife, and probably 5 or 6 steps that you make sure that you get that consistency. Because if you missed one of those key steps, you're not likely to get the results that you want.
Yeah.
But the specifics of how you do that probably start to be a little bit more applied flexibly, and maybe you figure out a few things that work for you, and you add those into your specific script. And if they make sense generally and they help to improve the results, then you bring it forward to everyone else. And conversely, one of the things that we certainly teach to companies that run on the EOS is to look to how you can continue to optimize and simplify the process, because maybe there are assumptions that you built in that no longer fit anymore. And so those can help to simplify. We're finding like we always cut with their knife and then our knife, and we're starting to find actually we get the exact same results if we don't use their knife first, or vice versa. We always have to use their knife, but if we don't follow these other two steps, we still get the same results. And so it just helps to kind of clarify and simplify over time.
Absolutely. That's great. Awesome. Well, on behalf of our viewers, thank you for joining today, Chris, and for sharing your passion for process. I'm sure it's going to be helpful for people as they develop their business. So if someone wants to learn more about you and your coaching and what you do, how should they get in touch with you?
Yeah, there's probably the two best ways are either LinkedIn. So I'm available on LinkedIn. And as well, I've got a website at eosworldwide.com/Chris-McPhee in the Calgary area. And yeah, happy to have a conversation if there's some curious or just want some tips on even how to get started with getting that basic part of your process. We call it component, how to get that strengthened. So either way is great.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Awesome. So if today's interview added value to you, please subscribe to this channel for future interviews with experts in the world of business.